My presentation this morning is entitled Multi-Level Conflict, Communal Conflict, Civil War, and Peacemaking in South Sudan. Focusing on South Sudan this morning is timely, even though the country and the civil war in neighboring Sudan are not prominent in the news right now, given the horrific escalation in other conflict theaters. Yet a few weeks ago, South Sudan marked the 5-year anniversary of its latest peace agreements, the so-called revitalized peace agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan. And within just a few weeks, the outbreak of the South Sudanese civil war on 13 December 2013 will be remembered. I would like to start my presentation with the following quote from Professor Jok Madhu Jok, a South Sudanese professor of anthropology of war and peace at Syracuse University in the US. And I quote, "African conflicts are more multifaceted than they might appear to distant observers, creating wars within war." It is precisely the wars within war that my presentation this morning focuses on. I will attempt to dissect how these wars within war play out on the national and on the local level, how they interact, and how such interlinkages shape the course of armed conflict and violence against civilians. I will offer a conceptualization of multi-level conflict and then apply the concept to a comparative case study of two regions within South Sudan that experienced high levels of communal violence but were differently affected by the civil war. One remaining under government control and one being highly contested during the civil war. And in reflecting on my empirical findings, my aim is to formulate the implications of multi-level conflict for peacemaking, for civilian protection, and for the broader prospects of peace for a country such as South Sudan. Although my argument is built on the case of South Sudan and my fieldwork in the country, I think it has implications for conflict analysis and for peace research in other sub-Saharan African countries and beyond. Peace is finally here. That was the promise of Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan, the world's youngest country, after the latest peace deal was signed in September 2018. You might be familiar with the two faces in the picture, Salva Kiir on the left, and Riek Machar, the former and current vice president, a main leader of the opposition group, on the right. South Sudan became independent in 2011 after decades of a horrific civil war with Sudan, and sadly descended into its own civil war only 2 years later. To many South Sudanese researchers and analysts working with international organizations and the UN mission on the ground, the outbreak of the civil war 10 years ago came as no surprise. Although the country had officially been at peace for 7 years, civilians across the country suffered the devastating impact of another form of armed conflict, communal war. And for some communities, their experiences of communal violence remained so intense that the National Peace Agreement was meaningless. Protracted cycles of attacks and counterattacks, massive cattle raiding, the destruction of livelihoods, the widespread kidnapping of women and children were perpetrated by community-based militias. And these militias had already been deeply entrenched in the civil war against Sudan and in the violence against civilians during the so-called peace period before 2013. They killed thousands of South Sudanese during that period. And many of these deaths remained unreported as they took place in remote, rural, difficult-to-reach settlements in a country that is roughly the size of France, but has extremely limited road infrastructure. The reported death toll certainly reached beyond the standard civil war threshold, which is more than 1,000 people killed per year. The legacies of large-scale communal violence, the strengths of various militias, were instrumental for the outbreak and the death toll of the South Sudanese civil war. During the civil war, most journalists, analysts, observers kept their eye on the movement between military forces, government military forces, and rebel military forces, on shifting front lines and on troop movements. And the national staff and diplomats analyzed the Juba-based political elite, the different roles, the changing alliances. and the role of the neighboring countries, particularly Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and the meddling in the civil war. The focus on the standard civil war actors, government military forces, rebel military forces, the influence of regional governments and their politics is, of course, very much understandable for a civil war at this scale. It has been estimated in 2018 that the South Sudanese civil war killed at least 400,000 people, of which at least 190,000 were directly killed in battle. However, analysts who worked with the UN mission in the country during the civil war years estimated, based on their reporting from field offices, that at least half of the conflict deaths were in fact attributable to communal conflicts rather than civil war fighting. There was little understanding of why and how communal conflicts continued, despite the devastating impact of the civil war and despite the presence of one of the largest UN peacekeeping missions in the country to date. Furthermore, incidents of communal violence remained underreported, as journalists faced serious access constraints and an international audience uninterested in the details of what was often perceived as simply tribal conflicts, cattle-related conflicts over land and settlements. My research on multi-level conflict is based on fieldwork in the country. I have completed 4 research trips since 2017, having been able to visit the country for brief research periods of up to 2 to 3 weeks each time in 2017 and 2018, and then in 2022 and in April this year. It is also very much based on the documents, the reporting, on the interviews with international and local staff, on the interviews with some of the civilians that have been reached through NGO programs, and on their views of how communal conflict and civil war have interacted. My research on multi-level conflict and my presentation pursues 3 interrelated research questions. First, how do communal conflict and civil war interlink? Second, what explains variation in spread and in intensity of communal violence during the civil war? And third, what mechanisms alter the course of communal violence during civil war? But before I start, let me briefly define what I mean with communal conflict. Concepts are, of course, fundamental to the study of armed conflict, especially when we talk about an armed conflict as complex as the one in South Sudan. The standard definition of civil war is a state-based conflict to which one of the conflict parties is the government of the state, resulting in at least 1,000 deaths per year. A standard definition of communal conflict is non-state armed conflict fought between 2 or more social groups. And communal conflicts can, of course, show significant variation in types and in scale. In communal conflicts, the government is no official party to the conflict, but this fact that it is a non-state-based conflict does not mean that the state is a meaningless category in these types of conflicts. Communal conflicts are often referred to as ethnic, religious, or even tribal, or as farmer-herder conflicts. And these labels are descriptive, and they carry assumptions about the nature of the conflict, but these need to be critically investigated. Communal conflicts take place in the shadow of the state, and they have a political dimension that is fundamental to how they escalate. They are fought over access to resources and political representation. And access to resources and political representation are regulated by state institutions, by national politics, and by lawmaking. And lastly, a communal war is defined as a communal conflict resulting in at least 1,000 deaths per year. So in my research on multi-level conflict, I start with the very basic assumption that civil war often interlinks with other types of conflict, be that communal conflict, election violence, terrorism, gang and militia violence, before, during, and after war. And the complexity of these armed conflicts is, of course, nothing new to point out. I hope to contribute to a more systematic analysis of this complexity by focusing on how different types of political violence interlink, on what that interlinkage means for how conflicts escalate and de-escalate. So I define multi-level conflict here as armed conflict in which two or more types of political violence interlink and thereby alter the course of conflict dynamics and of violence against civilians. Before I do so in the empirical analysis that I will briefly present, let me give you a very brief overview of the civil war in South Sudan. The civil war, as I said, broke out in December 2013, and I can only summarize it here in very elementary terms. Fighting broke out between security forces loyal to President Salva Kiir from the ethnic Dinka group and security forces loyal to Riek Machar, then vice president, and from the Nuer ethnic group. The Dinka and the Nuer represent the largest ethnic groups in South Sudan, and the political rivalries between Kiir and Machar and their associated communities sparked fighting, followed by pogroms against the Nuer population in Juba, the capital of the country. These pogroms against the Nuer population led to many civilians, especially the Nuer, fleeing to UN peacekeeping bases, establishing the so-called protection of civilian sites. Machar fled north towards Nuer-dominated territory, and the ethnic cleansing of Nuer populations in Juba ultimately led to an alliance between Nuer government soldiers and Nuer communal militias under the leadership overall on the rebel side of Riek Machar. This is a very basic summary of the conflict. The civil war primarily affected the states northeast to Juba, with a dominant Nuer population, especially Jonglei, a very large area north of Juba, and neighboring Upper Nile and Unity states. Only later did the civil war then also travel south, affecting the Equatorias. The western states in the country, Lakes, Warp, and others, remained largely under government control. My comparative case study focuses on the two states with high levels of communal violence before, during, and after the civil war, but different experiences during the civil war. One is Lake State, which remained under government control, dominated by the Dinka population, and the other one is the neighboring Jonglei State, very much contested during the civil war, with many shifting front lines throughout the years of fighting. Jonglei has long remained the epicenter of large-scale communal violence in South Sudan. Communal violence here means both intra-ethnic fighting among the Nuer clans and inter-ethnic fighting between the Nuer, the Dinka, and the Merle ethnic groups. The 2013 targeting of the ethnic Nuer led to a mobilization among the Nuer in response to the civil war. And that mobilization against an outgroup enemy, against the opposition in the civil war, suppressed intra-communal violence among the Nuer. The formation of the opposition movement established a limited form of rebel rule under Nuer territory. A kind of government rule, rebel governance provided authority to address intra-communal violence. This means, for example, re-establishing and reviving courts and lawmaking, customary lawmaking, to address long-standing intra-communal violence among Nuer clans. This authority to address these long-standing conflicts came from the military force of the opposition group during the war years. So mobilization against the government forces, Dinka-dominated, and conflict resolution via rebel governance temporarily suppressed intra-Nuer fighting. A second mechanism was absorbing inter-communal violence between Nuer, Dinka, and Merle militias. Because of the ethnicized dimension of the conflict, communal militias were absorbed into the civil war fighting, into rebel groups or fighting alongside them. And the so-called White Army, for example, the Nuer-based militias, are one particular case in point. They became the backbone of the rebel forces led or represented by Riek Machar during the war years. In summary, civil war and government territorial control resulted in an escalation of intra-communal violence, resulted in suppressing both intra and intercommunal violence in Jonglei State in an area that remained under government control. What does that mean for the post-conflict period? Event data collected by international organizations shows us that since the 2018 peace agreement, communal violence has been on the rise again, and especially incidents have exploded. So this shows that the suppression of intra and intercommunal violence during the Civil War was temporary, and the dynamics have changed again with the peace agreement. My second comparative case study is Lake State, and that is a Dinka-dominated area that remained under government control. No civil war fighting took place here. During the Civil War, intra-communal violence among the Dinka clans, which had been very much present before the Civil War, escalated further. And to me, at least, this is somewhat surprising, given that this is the ethnic group associated with the government during a civil war, experiencing no civil war fighting. The Dinka remained loyal to the government based on the ethnicized nature of the civil war. But government neglect and the proliferation of arms and small arms fighting weapons and the impunity, the lawlessness of the entire territory ultimately furthered an escalation of intra-communal violence. In addition, intercommunal violence also escalated. And that was intercommunal violence between Dinka and Nuer communities across the Civil War front line, very much mirroring the actual Civil War cleavage, to the extent that one may well question what here is communal violence and what is civil war, and that is very much a question that many analysts have grappled with for the context of South Sudan. In summary, civil war and government control resulted in an escalation of intra-communal violence among the Dinka and an escalation of intercommunal violence between Dinka and Nuer communities. Again, what does that mean for the post-conflict period? Event data for Lake States also demonstrates an escalation of communal violence after the peace agreement. So we see an escalation of intra and intercommunal violence during the Civil War for this area, and again after the Civil War. What does this mean? The trends for Jonglei, which was very differently affected during Civil War, and the trends in violence for Lakes mirror each other and are very much similar during the post-conflict period. So why does then analysis of multi-level conflict matter for peacemaking? Fast forward to the current state of South Sudan. Since the peace agreement in 2018, violence against civilians remains pervasive. In April this year, for example, the latest report of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan testified to the high levels of violence against civilians and noted that, I quote, nearly all of the 14 of the United Nations risk factors for atrocity crimes are now present in South Sudan. And this report was released before the Sudanese civil war broke out. It is not only the legacies of the horrific civil war, but also the massive communal violence that has devastated the country. The humanitarian situation in the country is as dire as never before. Very high levels of food insecurity, a situation almost close to famine, now characterize large parts of the country. Even upon independence and during the Civil War, food insecurity was never reported as extreme as it is today, 5 years after the peace agreement. One last figure showing the trends of armed conflict overall in South Sudan since the peace agreement. The figure shows you that both incidents, fatalities, but especially the number of incidents has exploded over recent years. It clearly identifies a trend towards more instability, which is extremely worrisome as South Sudan grapples with the slow implementation of the peace agreement that was concluded 5 years ago and is preparing for national elections next year. To address the rising intercommunal violence, which has now been very much recognized by the UN and other international observers as a key destabilizing factor that has a potential for massive atrocity crimes in the context of renewed elections next year, the UN mission in South Sudan and many civil society organizations and NGOs have facilitated local peace agreements. These initiatives often bring together an extensive number of community leaders and high-level church leaders and mediators. And even though these local peace efforts are very much necessary, they often neglect how the civil war and how the national level politics in fact shape the local context for peacemaking. Communal conflicts were differently affected, differently influenced, and differently altered by the civil war. And local communities are differently tied to national political elites. And these very different ties to elites and the very different legacies of the civil war shape the prospects of local peacemaking in accordance with national peacemaking. So I'd like to conclude with the following. I think a careful analysis of the dynamics of multi-level conflict can aid peacebuilding in order to better understand how peacebuilding on the local level can be supported in accordance with the national level. Analyzing conflicts through the concept of multi-level conflict should prevent the researchers from drowning in the complexity of a civil war, such as the one in South Sudan, or the one in the DRC, or the one in the Central African Republic. And the concept should also aid the identification of entry points for local level peacemaking in connection to the national peace process. Unfortunately, 5 years after the latest peace agreement, the situation in the world's newest country remains bleak. In the words of Alan Boswell, the South Sudan analyst for the International Crisis Group, in a statement earlier this year, I think he summarized aptly, and I quote, "The situation is horrendous in South Sudan, and it seems to be getting worse despite the peace deal." Thank you for your attention.